Welcome to the Freelance Journalism Podcast. I am Catherine Reynolds Lewis, and I am thrilled to be here today with my buddy Erika Hayasaki to talk about this fabulous episode that we have for you. Erika, what are we going to hear about today?
Hi, I'm so glad to be here too. Today we are speaking with Gil Asakawa, who is a freelance writer who has for a long time covered music and also Japanese-American communities and Asian American communities. And Gil just talked to us about, his whole career arc, which I found it to be really inspiring because, he has started in a place of passion, what he's passionate about, and built his career around that. So I had a great time talking to him. I think you're going to really enjoy the episode.
I loved that. We often hear you need a brand or a niche. And I think sometimes folks get boxed in by that because they think you only need one. And he really had several, right?
Yeah.
That he's sort of known for. And I think that's really instructive for a lot of us on how to sort of develop that, follow your passion, and also leave the door open that as things shift, you're going to have a new chapter and maybe overlap at the same time. So I felt like there was so much from this conversation, Erika, and he just seemed like such a sweetheart. I'm like,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love that part too. I love the idea that none of us are a single story, and we can bring that into our work. And also when you're thinking about branding, which I think for a lot of us is, for me, I struggle with branding. I just really do. But it doesn't have to be so literal. You can just present your interests according to how he's done it. And then, the people who connect with your interests find you. And so I think he was really instructive in sharing that too.
I agree. And I look forward to listening to it again. Hope you all enjoy this episode too.
Thank you. Enjoy. I'm so excited to be the host today, interviewing Gil Asakawa about a very long career and all of the work that you do. Just to remind everybody, the Institute for Independent Journalists' mission is the financial and emotional sustainability of freelancers of color. And so we're really glad that you're here. And I wanted to get to introduce you, Gil. So Gil is a Denver-based freelance journalist and writer who specializes in writing about Japanese Americans. He's written for Nichibei News, Pacific Citizen, Huffington Post, and Rolling Stone. And he's also published 2 books, Being Japanese-American and Tabemoshi, Let's Eat, all about Japanese American food. And he's also co-authored and contributed to additional books. So thank you for being here, Gil. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to chat with us.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, I was saying earlier that I'm surprised we haven't had our paths cross in the real world, not the online world.
Me too.
Before this, because we've both been going at this for so long. But I would really love to hear about how you got into journalism and how you started writing about specifically Asian American and Japanese American issues. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I am not a trained journalist. That was kind of my opening line when I used to talk about being a journalist. I went to art school in New York City from high school in Denver. And my goal was to work for Marvel Comics as an artist. But then I ended up graduating with a BFA in painting. Maybe the most useless degree on the face of the earth. But it really gave me the opportunity to spend my time in the campus radio station, become a huge music fan. I learned to play guitar. There's a guitar back there, a couple of guitars back there. And I started writing like music things. And I had written music in high school, like music reviews, and as well as doing cartooning and stuff for the high school newspaper. But when I graduated from art school, I knew that a career in art, fine art, not going to happen. So I went to work in a paint store, and I met a woman who's the editor of a weekly paper, a weekly arts section in Boulder, Colorado. because I moved back to Colorado after school, and I became a writer, a freelance writer for her, covering the art scene. And then I said, oh, I could write about music because I had written a couple pieces while I was in college about music, and that's what I started doing. A year later, I took all my clippings to Denver, to the alt weekly in Denver called Westward, which is still around, and that was in 1979. And Westward was started in 1977. They allowed me to write art things and music things. Pretty soon I gave up on the art stuff and I just focused on music. I was their first music editor. And so I went to a couple thousand concerts. I, amassed a record collection, albums, vinyl records of like 4,000 or 5,000 records. And then later 3,000 or 4,000 CDs, and then later tens of thousands of streaming audio files. And I was a music critic for a long time, kind of a crusty, cranky, mean one. I had bands break up after I wrote about them, local bands. But I also started writing news stories. And some of the things I'm proud of stuff from even back then in the 1980s are news stories that I wrote. Some cover stories, some long investigative pieces, as well as lots and lots of feature stories. I used to cover kind of a nonprofit scene, and I used to be really mean to Mile High United Way because I questioned the way they raised money and what they spent their money on. And I would write stories like that. And then at one point I went to work for an NPR radio station. A radio show called E-Town with live music. And I helped get that show off the ground. And then I became the entertainment editor for a daily paper in Colorado Springs called The Gazette, which is, it's still around, daily paper. And I was their entertainment editor in charge of their weekly Friday section. And I wrote a lot of stories. I assigned a lot of stories, and I did all that whole newspaper world thing. And then this thing called the internet happened. And so my life ever since like 1996 has been online. I worked for AOL for a few years. And then I came back to Denver, and I was the manager of the denverpost.com website. And I was all this time I was also doing some freelance work for like Rolling Stone magazine, because I had been, from my career as a music critic, I'd made all these contacts. And so I took advantage of those and wrote about local bands in Colorado, gave them their first exposure in Rolling Stone, and then started to do some national things. And then I just became more involved in online startups. And I don't know, slowly but surely, I kind of got out of the newspaper biz and ended up working for startups as content editor, like technology startups. And on the side, I started writing a blog, a column actually, for a local Japanese community newspaper, Japanese-American community newspaper in Denver, which is no longer around. And I was in there every week alongside a guy named Gil Asakawa, who was a Denver Post editor for 30-some years. Crusty guy. He and I disagreed on a lot of things. And he refused, when the internet happened, he refused to use email ever. But he and I were colleagues. And so I covered the local Japanese-American community and wrote kind of stuff off the top of my head about me, because I was born in Japan, in Tokyo, and I had this kind of bicultural upbringing as a Japanese American, but my family was not incarcerated, so I don't have that background, but I certainly became immersed in it with the Denver community. So I just started becoming more and more of an expert on the local Japanese-American community and the national Japanese-American community. Then I got really involved in the Asian-American, the broader Asian-American Pacific Islander, or now the Asian-American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community, and was involved in an event called the Colorado Dragon Boat Festival for 16 years as a volunteer, and did all the media and website and newsletters and all this stuff, and really became my intro to the Pan-Asian community. So that's where my passion is now. I write about Asian American identity, Japan, and Japanese American identity. And, being Japanese American is kind of a memoir of growing up Japanese American, born in Japan, and kind of becoming involved with the JA community in the United States. And Tabemoshi is the history of Japanese food in America, because when I was a kid and we moved to the US when I was in 3rd grade, I was teased for, you eat that raw fish stuff. That's gross.
Yeah.
And I swear to you, the grandkids of those bullies today are buying pretty crappy sushi from their grocery stores 3 times a week, and they're feeling really hip and
And I used to bring nori to class and get teased, right? And now it's in every grocery store.
Yeah, it's like a common snack. Yeah. It's like a potato chip.
Right. Well, I love that. I love that journey that you just laid out for us, because I think, first of all, a lot of people think you have to have a degree in journalism. Right. I teach journalism. It's very helpful to have that, but it's not the only way into this business. And really, in many ways, you learn by doing. And I'm always emphasizing that also when I talk to young people who want to be journalists. But also we sort of think about, we have to start doing everything, and then eventually we'll find something that we're passionate about within the journalism kind of beats that we cover. But you started with your passion and turned it into a career. And I think that's really inspiring for a lot of people.
I actually tell young people all the time, because, yes, there are lots of journalists who are GA, general assignment reporters, and they're proud of the fact that their knowledge base is, a mile wide and an inch deep, that you can assign them to cover a city council story and then a car crash and then a drug overdose, and they can write all of that, which is fine. But I tell young people, first, you have to be a good storyteller. You have to know when you see a good story, right? What makes a good story. And then you have to have that ability to tell that story. So I loved English when I was in school, when I was a kid. I read lots of books. I took journalism in high school, never took a journalism class in college because I went to art school. And I really did learn by doing. And I think it's important to find gigs and be attracted to editors who can help you. Because I still count some of my earliest editors, my bosses, one of my bosses, as a mentor still to this day. And I still write stories for her. So, but I was really lucky that I was passionate about something already when I fell into the journalism world. I wanted to be a rock critic. I read Rolling Stone cover to cover. I knew all the writers. I read all the writers. So I understood the styles. I understood what they were criticizing and how they were criticizing. I would just soak that stuff up. And I think that's what, you find what you want to do, and then you find the ways to inspire yourself to become good at wanting, at what you want to do. And that's kind of what I did. I just kind of immersed myself in it. And I blew it. I blew it a lot. I read some of my early things and I cringe. And I had early on, I had people write letters to Westward saying, "What the hell? This guy doesn't know anything, blah, 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 blah." And I'd be all embarrassed, but then I just kind of keep writing. But you have to find what it is you're passionate about. And I really tell people that what you're doing is, especially in this day, when you're not guaranteed a lifelong gig in a newsroom, or even a 5-year gig in a newsroom anymore, find your passion, and know what your brand is. You have to build a brand for yourself. And I feel like I've done that. People still think of me as a music critic. It's amazing to me that they remember how mean I was, I guess, to this day. But then I also have consciously built myself a brand as kind of an expert speaker, panelist, moderator, writer, and consultant on Asian American and Japanese American things. And I think that's what you need to do. Find a niche in the freelance world.
Yeah, I love the advice of finding those mentors, whether they're the editors, sometimes they can be the professors who are also the journalists, or just other people in your community who can kind of guide you along. And also recognizing that it is wonderful to have the newsroom experience, because I also had that. Yes. And you do everything and you learn a lot. But at the same time, freelance allows you to really nurture the passions that you already want, or, heading toward with music and the other kind of writing. And so I'm wondering for you, and I want to talk more about building a brand too. How did you make that transition? Because for me, it was quite hard figuring out how to go from a newsroom to freelance. And I just didn't get any responses for, like years probably, actually. But how did you do that? Because it's really a different kind of beast.
It is. And I got, once again, I got lucky because of my work as a music critic in Denver for the alt weekly paper, I would send off queries to Rolling Stone of all, like I'm shooting for the top, right? And I also started going to South by Southwest and the New Music Seminar, which are industry conventions for the music industry. And whenever I went to these things, I would go out of my way to meet people. I'm like, oh yeah, you're at Rolling Stone. I read you all the time. Hey, blah, 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 blah. Here's a card. Can I send you some of my clips? And I actually built all these relationships. Actually, when I think about it now, it's very non-Asian to promote myself like that. But that's what I wanted to do. Sure. So I got to know people. I started to pitch stories. And then the fact that I was in Denver was actually a plus, because if there was some new band coming out of Denver that nobody had ever heard of, Big Head Todd and the Monsters, there's a Korean guy who's a guitar player, lead singer. Yeah, let's write about him. Or a reggae band from Colorado. Yeah, let's write. I got to write stories about these bands from Colorado because I was in Colorado. And so identifying those stories was really important. And so I was already writing a couple pieces freelance while I was still at Westward. And then I jumped from Westward to this radio show, E-Town. And then I went to, gosh, I've had such a weird career. When I was at the Denver Post, actually, I was at Media News Group, the Denver Post's owner. And in 2010, they laid me and my boss, who was the head of editorial for the digital side, right, for for Media News Group Interactive. And I was the kind of the production editor. I forget what the title was. And then my boss was the director of editorial. And we both got laid off. After that, I went to work at University of Colorado. My goal was not to be an academic, because no offense to any academics, I know you're at UC Irvine, but I
know the downside.
Yeah. And I spent 10 years at CU Boulder, but I was not a professor or an instructor. I was the advisor for the student-run news website. And we won a bunch of, regional awards, Society of Professional Journalists awards and stuff. And it was a great time. But then the department at the university reorganized, and they dropped the budget to pay for an advisor. Amazingly, the students have continued it as a volunteer organization without an advisor. Or they have some volunteer advisor who's a professor or something. And since then, but after that happened, I was kind of forced to become a freelancer for the better part of a year, I worked for a kind of a natural foods company in Boulder, Colorado, writing editorial stories for their website and magazine. And then they cut my budget. So really for the last almost 2 years, I've been completely freelance, which kind of sucks. After you're used to making a pretty high salary with benefits, to suddenly have to pay for your health benefits. And of course, one of the saying is it sucks to get old, but one of the good things to get old is that I now have Medicare paying for
That's
a
right.
lot of my health care. But the one thing about freelance that is a pain, especially in my world where I'm writing a lot for small publications, I get it's the pay. I get $75 for a book review, for a book, a self-publishing book review site that was founded by a former Rocky Mountain News book editor that I've written for like 30 years now. And I love reading the books she sends me, and she'll pay me $75 per review, which is just not much. But I do that. I'll do stuff for $150. I'll do stuff for $400. It's not very much, but it's starting to add up because I've built my brand. Now I have two pretty regular outlets like the Nichibei in San Francisco, Pacific Citizen based out of LA, which is the national newspaper of the JACL, Japanese-American Citizens League. And I've been writing quite a bit for both publications, and they've upped their budget to pay, for each of my articles. They've upped the amount that they pay out of grants. So that's gotten better, but you really have to build that slowly. And you get used to being turned down. You get used to sending off queries and not hearing back ever, But once you have outlets that you work with, I have this very collegial relationship. I'll send, the editor of either publication, hey, I think this would fit the PC. Do you want that? Or I'll send a separate email to the Nichibei. And so I juggle these kind of different story ideas according to which outlet I think they would better fit.
Yeah, a lot of juggling takes place. And then also just, I wonder how you think about managing different assignments and taking on different kinds of work. And do you mix it up with journalism and communications? And do you weigh the things like that might offer you less pay, but you're very passionate about versus the things that maybe offer more pay, but they're not necessarily your main passion? How do you do that?
I've done a fair amount of marketing writing where my name isn't on the text.
Right.
I specifically say that, and without fail, those things pay more. Sadly. But I got paid fairly well for a report from the Colorado Institute of Health about. I got to interview 3 different groups of Asian Americans for. The report was a pretty in-depth report with statistics, and I was kind of the editorial context for Asian Americans who are generally not. We're all lumped into one, right? And for almost all kind of news coverage and data journalism and statistics, and so I spoke in one article to the South Asian community, one article to the kind of the refugee and immigrant community, and one to an organization who has been trying to revive the knowledge of a Chinatown that used to thrive in Denver, downtown Denver in the late 1800s. And so that's been, and that one project paid fairly well. I'm working on a project for historic Denver and the National Park Service about the history of the Japanese-American community in the one block. I jokingly call it Tiny Tokyo. It's the It's Denver's Little Tokyo area, and it's one block called Sakura Square. And I'm writing a long piece for that will pay me fairly well, and that will eventually be archived at the National Archives. That's kind of cool. So things kind of fall into my lap again because of what people know me for. I get asked to speak about the Japanese-American incarceration camp in Colorado. Just did that yesterday for a group of retired teachers. I'm giving the same speech at PowerPoint and speech at a church in Boulder in a couple weeks. And then in October, I'm teaching a 4-week class, co-teaching a class at the University of Denver about the history of Japanese Americans in Colorado and that Amachi, which is the concentration camp in Colorado. So it's like people now know my name and attach it to things that come across their desk.
Yeah. Do you think, some journalists are very strict about not maybe doing communications work with, and that's in the same world as their journalism. But for you, you bring yourself into your stories. You said you've done personal writing. Music writing is obviously personal in many ways too. Do you think that not everybody has to worry so much, or how do you think about that?
I chalk it all up to storytelling, right? I actually feel like if I had been, if I'd gone to journalism school, I would have too many rules in my head. First person? No. Right. No first person. And
not in my classes. Okay, I'm always there.
Well, yeah, and you're a feature writer, so
right,
you do great, really interesting long form stories. If you're doing kind of those kind of magazine stories, that's different from doing like breaking news for a newspaper. Yeah, I've written those 6-inch stories, 300 words, and if you write more than that, the rule back in the day anyway, the editors would go, okay, well, see, it's a inverted pyramid, so after 3 inches, we're just going to chop off everything. We're not going to edit it. We're just going to chop it off.
Right.
And I've always kind of worked in the world of feature writing, magazine writing, long form for websites, and even for newspapers, like weekly newspapers, where I have more room to kind of build that narrative arc and start with a narrative lead, not a jam-packed news lead, and to have a closing comment at the end that wraps it all up in a nice, tidy package. I love to do that. I'm really proud of my, when I get it right, I know I nailed it, and I go, yeah, okay, that was a good one, and I'm proud of that. So it's it really is kind of a different kind of a skill set.
Yeah.
But you adjust, right? And I have always written with a fair amount. I'm not always first person. I've written my share of news stories. I covered a national cancer research nonprofit that was based in Denver in the 1980s for Westward. I covered with 2 cover stories and 3 long form stories within issues in the period of a year until I got the president and CEO of this nonprofit fired because he was totally misusing funds, taking donations from little old ladies to cure cancer, and he would go live high on the hog and stay at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. And I was lucky enough to have somebody who got me the receipts, literally the receipts, so that I could write about this guy. And it took a year, but I got his ass fired. And that kind of stuff is what I'm the most proud of. And but outside of that, I did use first person. I've always thought it was important to write conversationally.
Yes.
That's kind of what I learned from being a music critic, right?
Yeah.
My audience are music fans just like me, and I would kind of think like the writers that I loved reading early on before my career, and I would try to synthesize those kinds of styles into my own voice. So you create your own voice. I feel like my voice is uniquely weird and mine now, but it's definitely not academic. It's not dry, and it's not blam 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 blam.
Yeah.
News writing.
Yeah. I would say when I moved into freelance work and more features and creative long form, certainly I had to like shed those lessons of never ever first person. And what's refreshing is that you do bring yourself into it and you can have perspective.
Yeah.
And sometimes that perspective is there even if it's not in first person. It's in the details that you choose and how you write something. But I wonder, like, when you're building your brand, because that's actually been harder in terms of like social media and all that. For me, I'm pretty terrible, but you do have to bring yourself into that as well.
Yes.
And even like blogging or Substacks these days, or even just, social media posts. How do you build your brand? Can you talk
That's
a little
actually
bit
an interesting point, because social media did change the rules of how you identify yourself and how you build an audience. So even early on, because part of my job at the Denver Post, in 2001, the Denver Post was the first daily newspaper to have a daily podcast. I hired college students from CU Denver, University of Colorado in Denver, to log on at 1 a.m. when all the stories at the Denver Post were posted online. They had to read them, synthesize them, write them into like radio scripts, and then record them and send them to the Denver Post. And we would upload them by 6 a.m. And we got coverage from the Wall Street Journal for these podcasts, which was kind of cool. We got advertising.
Wow.
Didn't last real long, but it was a cool. This was what, 2002, 2003. I started blogs at the Denver Post and got people in the community, because the editor of the paper at the time wouldn't allow his writers, the columnists, to write extra stuff for a blog. So I hired people from outside in the community and paid them a little bit to write blogs. And so we were always kind of messing around, and I started paying attention to Facebook as soon as Facebook happened, and then YouTube and the other early social media platforms, because I felt like, just like with the internet, newspapers were resistant to the internet. They didn't think it was important to have a website. I saw immediately that the fact that a scientist from Colorado Springs who's stationed in Antarctica could be reading my art reviews and music reviews in Antarctica and then send an email that we would publish as a letter from a reader, I'm like, this is awesome. This is, we're now a worldwide thing.
Sure.
And newspaper owners and editors and publishers didn't always see that. But I always embraced the newest thing all the time, including social media. And part of my job was to track the statistics, right? The page views. And we use this tool called Omniture back in the day. And Omniture would tell you how much time people spent on the homepage, how many people clicked into stories, which promos were the most effective. It's, it was an early way to judge. We didn't even call it clickbait, but it really is what clickbait is based on now, is what will get people to click and engage with your content. And that really is at the heart of social media, because one of the main stats I looked at all the time, and I started telling people in the newsroom, you all need to be on social media. You need to promote your stories. It's part of building your brand. I would tell reporters all the time, build your brand, get known for what you do outside of the newsroom.
Sure.
You got to have a Facebook account. You got to have a Twitter account. You got to have, later when Instagram happened, Instagram, all these things. And then you link back to your story on the Denver Post. And I was able to tell reporters that, 40% of traffic to our website came from Facebook posts. And, when you look at that, you start to realize the importance of social media. And you have to start thinking about, okay, well, what's the wording that we use? What's the image that we use? And that's, clickbait is dangerous because it really, then you're going for the lowest common denominator. You're looking for the trashy stuff and the overstatements and the exaggerations to lie and get people to click. I just like to pick the best stories and promote them in the best honest way. But that's how you do social media. And also, even in my social media early on, I would say for the last better part of 10 years, I've kind of become known for a couple of things. One is food porn. I'm Asian, so I take pictures of food. I'm sorry, that's just what I do. And I hashtag it food porn. And people actually, they follow that in a crazy way, and also early on I started, because I write about Asian American and Japanese American content, I link to those, and then I promote stories about the community. I promote stories about travel to Japan, what's going on in China, Hong Kong, Singapore, India, and I kind of make my Facebook feed, Instagram page, kind of a forum for, Instagram not so much, but Facebook. And when I used to use Twitter, I use Threads more now. But I might go back to X because there are still a lot of media people on X. I stopped using it.
I stopped over a year ago.
But I share stories that are of interest to me on the assumption that they would be of interest to people who follow me.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, especially if you come out of a newsroom type of setting, at least for me, the identity of the newsroom can kind of be your identity. It can become your identity, especially when you're young. And then if you haven't really cultivated your own identity on social, because you've been taught so much to just, it's not about you, right? And obviously it's not when you're doing journalism, but you do have something that makes you unique and you can bring to your work.
Right.
Then when you might leave or get laid off or just choose to leave or do freelance, then you're trying to sort of figure out, who am I without the newsroom? And so it's really important. I can see why cultivating this presence and being comfortable with that online is key, because it's here's who I am, and it's who I am with my food porn, but also all the work that I do, whether it's food writing or Asian American writing and all of that.
Culture writing. It's all, it's all part of my image, my brand, my world. And I'm pretty conscious about that.
Yeah, you have to be conscious about it. It's not just here's my story, but it's more like here's me.
I also am, and this is where being a journalist comes in, I'm fairly careful to not be blatantly partisan. I mean, I am lots of times, but I'm not blatantly partisan. I'm not blatantly, I don't know. I know that what I'm trying to do is build as big of an audience as possible. I don't just want people who like punk rock or, whatever the flavor of the day might be in pop culture. I really want to be known as somebody people can rely on for the broad spectrum of news that I'm interested in. And I actually, years ago, I used to keep a separate list in my head of, these are the people who think of me as the music guy. Here's the people who think of me as the Asian guy. Here's the people who follow me for my food stuff. And I don't really do that anymore. But it's partly because I feel comfortable being kind of I don't want to toot my own horn, but I'm comfortable being accepted as an expert in certain areas and I'm fine with that. And if
Yeah.
people aren't interested in a food porn photo, they don't have to look at it, and it kind of goes with the sorts of stories I write about. I write a fair amount now about Asian or Asian American, Japanese-American pop culture. I ran a story recently about Netflix has this animated series called Ultraman Rising, and it's the voices in it are all Japanese Americans. First time that there's 6 well-known Japanese American stars giving their voices to an animation movie or series, and Tamlin Tomita is one of them. She's really great. She's a great interview all the time anyway. But so I wrote about that. I'm currently writing about a Japanese amateur sumo champion, young guy, who is a defensive lineman for the Colorado State University football team because he wants to play American football. And
Nice.
so I went up there and took pictures and interviewed him during a practice before the season. And we'll see how he does. But I'm writing that story for the Nichibei newspaper in San Francisco. And I am writing a story for Westward, the alt weekly that I started at. I'm writing a story for them now about a cold case, a murder from 1977, where the victim, the John Doe, was identified as Native American in 1977. They finally, the sheriff's department finally did a DNA test and discovered this body is Japanese. So I am now writing a story for Westward about how DNA works. How long ago was DNA started to be used for criminal cases, because it wasn't around in 1977, and see if I can try to find some way in the Japanese community here to find somebody who remembers a guy who went missing in February of 1977. Probably not going to be able to solve that one, but the story is now about this DNA process.
Sure, which is right. That's all right up my alley. That whole story. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Please do. Please keep us updated on all that. I think what you've also shown is that you're so multifaceted, as all of us are. I always like to say, like, none of us are just a single story, and so it seems like you're able to bring all of that into your brand, into your social media, and into your work, which I think is a really good lesson for all of us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being with us and for taking the time out of your day to talk to us a little bit about your career arc. I also love that, you can keep writing. I feel like as long as we can sort of do this forever once we know how to do it, as long as we still have our faculties.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I can't afford to retire. I have to work my ass off.
Most people cannot. Yeah, that's the reality.
The Freelance Journalism Podcast is a production of the Institute for Independent Journalists. Our mission is the emotional and financial sustainability of freelancers of color. Learn more about our work at theiij.com and use the code POD10 for a discount on our annual conference and other events open for registration now. That's POD number 10. And please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or both. You can find our free webinars and other offerings on YouTube. And your recommendation and sharing with friends is the greatest compliment and helps us discover new listeners. Thanks for listening.